If you understand English when you listen to it, maybe you can follow movies, maybe you can understand podcasts like this one right now. But the moment you try to speak, your mind goes completely blank. This episode is not about your vocabulary. It's not about grammar rules you forgot. It's about what's actually happening inside your brain in that exact moment when everything just stops. Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Mike.
And you're listening to the English Conversation Podcast, where we talk about the real human side of learning English, not just the textbook stuff, but the psychological part, the emotional part, the part that actually makes the difference between staying stuck and finally feeling like you can express yourself naturally.
Yeah, and today we're talking about something that I think almost every English learner has experienced at some point, which is this really frustrating situation where you're sitting there, you're listening to someone speak English, and in your head, you're following along perfectly. You understand every word, you're nodding, you're engaged, but then someone turns to you and says, "So, what do you think?" And suddenly, it's like your brain just hits a wall. Like all the words you know are somewhere in there, but you can't reach them. You can't pull them out, and you just freeze.
Exactly. And that freeze is what we're going to unpack today, because it's not about laziness, it's not about not studying enough, and it's definitely not about intelligence.
Right.
It's about how your brain is wired to process language, and more specifically, why understanding English and speaking English are two completely different skills that use different parts of your brain in very different ways.
So let's start with the most basic question, which is why does this happen? Like if I understand English when I hear it, shouldn't I be able to speak it just as easily? It feels like it should be the same skill, right?
That's what most people assume. And honestly, it makes sense why you'd think that. But the truth is, understanding and speaking are processed in completely different regions of your brain, and they require very different types of mental energy. When you're listening to English, your brain is in what we call a receptive mode, which means you're absorbing information, you're decoding sounds into meaning, you're matching words you hear with words you already know. And your brain is actually very good at this because listening is a passive skill in the sense that you don't have to produce anything, you just have to recognize patterns.
Right. So when I'm listening, I'm kind of like a detective. I'm piecing together clues, I'm using context, I'm using tone of voice, I'm using facial expressions if I'm watching someone. And even if I miss a word or two, my brain can usually fill in the gaps because I'm getting so much information all at once.
Exactly. And that's why listening comprehension often develops faster than speaking, because your brain is really efficient at pattern recognition. It's been doing that your whole life in your native language.
Right.
So when you start learning English, your brain just applies the same process. It starts recognizing English patterns, English sounds, English word order, and over time, that becomes more and more automatic.
But speaking is different.
Completely different, because speaking is a productive skill, which means your brain has to create something from scratch. It has to pull words out of your memory, it has to put them in the correct order, it has to think about grammar, it has to think about pronunciation, and it has to do all of that in real time, often in just a few seconds, because if you take too long to respond, the conversation moves on without you.
And that's where the freeze happens, right? Because it's not just about knowing the words, it's about accessing them fast enough. And if your brain isn't trained to do that yet, it just shuts down.
Exactly. And this is the part that I think a lot of learners don't realize, which is that the freeze isn't a sign that you don't know English. It's a sign that your brain hasn't built the pathways yet to retrieve English quickly under pressure. And that's a completely normal stage of learning. It doesn't mean you're failing, it just means you're still building that skill.
So let's talk about what's actually happening in your brain during that freeze moment. Because I think understanding the mechanics of it can help people realize, okay, this isn't personal. This isn't about me being bad at English. This is just how the brain works when it's learning something new.
Right. So imagine you're in a conversation. Someone asks you a question in English, and you understand the question perfectly, but now you have to respond. And in that split second, your brain starts doing a lot of things at once. First, it's trying to think of what you want to say, like the actual idea or opinion you want to express. And if you're not used to thinking in English yet, your brain will probably form that idea in your native language first, because that's still your default mode of thinking. That's where your brain feels safe and fast.
So let's say I speak Turkish, right? And someone asks me, "What did you do last weekend?" I understand the question, but in my head, I'm already starting to answer it in Turkish because that's how my brain naturally processes thoughts. And only after I form the idea in Turkish do I realize, oh wait, I need to say this in English.
Exactly. And that's where the translation loop starts, because now your brain has to take that Turkish sentence and translate it word by word into English, which is already a slow process.
Right.
But then you also start second guessing yourself, like, wait, is that the right word? Is that the right grammar? Does this sound natural? And the more you second guess, the more pressure you feel. And the more pressure you feel, the more your brain starts to panic. And when your brain panics, it just freezes. It's like a computer that's trying to run too many programs at once, and it just stops responding.
And by the time all of that happens, the other person's already looking at you, waiting, and you can feel that awkward silence getting longer and longer, and that makes the panic even worse.
Right, and this is why so many learners say, I know the words, I just can't get them out. Because the words are in there, they're stored in your memory, but your brain is so overwhelmed by the process of translating, monitoring, and worrying about mistakes that it can't actually access those words in the moment.
So the freeze isn't about not knowing English, it's about your brain being overloaded.
Exactly, and this is where the concept of mental bandwidth comes in, because your brain only has so much processing power available at any given moment. And when you're speaking a foreign language, especially in the early stages, you're using up almost all of that bandwidth just trying to translate and construct sentences. So there's no space left for fluency. There's no space left for spontaneity. You're just trying to survive the conversation.
And I think this is where a lot of advice that learners get, like just practice speaking more, can actually backfire. Because if your brain isn't ready yet, if you're still stuck in that translation loop, then practicing speaking is just going to reinforce the panic. It's going to reinforce the feeling of freezing, and that's not helpful.
Right, and that's such an important point because a lot of learners are told you just need to speak more, you need to push yourself, you need to get out of your comfort zone. And yes, speaking practice is essential eventually, but if you try to force yourself to speak before your brain has built the foundation for thinking in English, you're just going to create more anxiety, more frustration, and you're going to associate speaking English with that terrible feeling of freezing up.
So what's the foundation? What does the brain need before it's ready to speak fluently?
The foundation is internal fluency, which is the ability to think in English silently, without pressure, without anyone waiting for you to respond, just forming thoughts in your head in English naturally. And this is the part that most learners skip, because they think, okay, I understand English, so now I should just start speaking. But there's actually a huge middle step, which is learning to think in English first.
And that makes sense, because if you think about how native speakers use language, we're not translating in our heads, right?
No.
Like when I want to say something, the English words just come to me automatically because I'm already thinking in English. My thoughts are already in English. So speaking is just the act of voicing those thoughts out loud. It's not a separate process.
Exactly. And that's what fluency is. Fluency is when speaking becomes an extension of thinking, not a separate task that you have to do after thinking. And the reason native speakers don't freeze is because we're not doing that double work of thinking in one language and then translating into another. It's all happening in one language from the very beginning.
So if I'm a learner and I want to stop freezing when I speak, the first step isn't to speak more, it's to start thinking in English more.
Exactly. And this doesn't mean you have to narrate your entire day in English or have full conversations with yourself, although those things can help later. It just means starting to form little thoughts in English throughout your day, like simple observations, simple reactions, simple opinions, without any pressure to say them out loud. Just letting your brain practice creating English sentences internally.
Can you give an example of what that might look like?
Sure. So let's say you're sitting at home and you look outside and it's raining. Instead of thinking in your native language, oh, it's raining, I should bring an umbrella, you just pause for a second and think in English, it's raining outside, I should take an umbrella. And that's it. It's just a tiny moment of thinking in English, and the more you do that, the more your brain starts to build pathways for English thinking, and eventually, thinking in English becomes automatic.
And I think what's really important about that example is that there's no pressure, right? Like you're not speaking to anyone. You're not being judged. You're not worrying about pronunciation or grammar. You're just letting your brain play with English in a safe, private space.
Exactly. And that's why this approach works, because you're removing all the emotional pressure that causes the freeze in the first place. You're not trying to perform, you're not trying to impress anyone, you're just practicing the mental side of language, which is where fluency actually begins.
So let's talk about the emotional side of this, because I think for a lot of learners, the freeze isn't just about the brain needing more practice. It's also about fear. It's about perfectionism. It's about this deep worry that if they make a mistake, people will judge them or laugh at them or think they're stupid.
Absolutely. And this is huge because language learning is incredibly vulnerable. You're putting yourself out there. You're trying to express your thoughts and your personality in a language that doesn't feel natural to you yet. And if you're someone who's used to being articulate and intelligent in your native language, it can be really painful to suddenly feel like you sound like a child when you speak English.
Right. And that fear of sounding stupid or being judged is so powerful that it can completely override everything else. Like, even if you know the words, even if your brain is capable of producing a sentence, the fear just shuts everything down and you freeze not because you can't speak, but because you're terrified of how you'll sound if you do.
Exactly. And this is where self-monitoring becomes a problem, because a lot of learners are constantly listening to themselves as they speak, constantly analyzing every word, every pronunciation, every grammar choice. And that level of self-monitoring is exhausting. It takes up so much mental energy that there's nothing left for actual communication. And the irony is that the more you focus on not making mistakes, the more mistakes you make, because you're so tense and anxious that your brain can't access the language naturally.
So, how do you deal with that? How do you let go of the perfectionism and the fear?
Well, first, you have to recognize that perfectionism in language learning is not helpful. It's actually harmful because language is messy. It's full of mistakes. Even native speakers make mistakes all the time. We say we pause, we correct ourselves mid-sentence, we use the wrong word sometimes, and that's completely normal. That's just how communication works.
Right. And I think learners sometimes have this idea that native speakers speak perfectly all the time. But that's not true. Like, if you actually listen to real conversations, they're full of hesitations and fillers and incomplete thoughts. And that's okay. That's just natural speech.
Exactly. So if you can start giving yourself permission to be imperfect, to sound awkward, to make mistakes, you're actually going to speak more fluently because you're not wasting energy on self-monitoring. You're just focusing on expressing your ideas. And the more you do that, the more your brain learns to prioritize communication over perfection.
And I think another part of this is realizing that most people you're speaking with are not sitting there analyzing your grammar. They're just trying to understand what you're saying.
Exactly.
They're focused on the message, not the mistakes. And as long as you're communicating, you're succeeding.
Right. And this is something I wish more learners understood, which is that communication is about connection. It's about sharing ideas and understanding each other. It's not about grammatical accuracy. And if you can shift your focus from, am I saying this correctly, to, am I expressing what I want to express, you're going to feel so much more confident. And that confidence is what breaks the freeze.
So let's bring this back to something practical, because at this point, someone listening might be thinking, okay, I understand why I freeze. I understand that I need to think in English more, but how do I actually start doing that? Like, what's the smallest, simplest thing I can do today?
The smallest thing you can do is this. Tonight, before you go to sleep, spend 2 to 3 minutes lying in bed and just thinking in English. Not about anything complicated, just simple thoughts about your day. Like, today was tiring, or I had a good lunch, or I need to call my friend tomorrow. Just tiny, simple sentences. And don't worry if it feels slow or awkward at first. That's completely normal. You're just getting your brain used to the process of forming English thoughts without the pressure of speaking them out loud.
And I love that because it's so low pressure. Like you're alone, you're relaxed, you're not performing for anyone, you're just letting your brain practice in a safe space.
Exactly. And if you do this every night, even just for 2 or 3 minutes, your brain will start to get more comfortable with English thinking. And over time, those pathways will get stronger. And when you're in a real conversation and someone asks you a question, your brain won't have to translate anymore. It'll just start forming the answer in English automatically. And that's when the freeze starts to disappear.
So it's not about forcing yourself to speak more, it's about training your brain to think in English first, and once that becomes natural, speaking just flows from there.
Exactly, because speaking is just thinking out loud. And if your thinking is already in English, then speaking becomes so much easier, so much more natural. And you stop freezing because your brain isn't overloaded anymore. It's just expressing what it's already thinking.
And I think that's the key insight of this whole episode, which is that fluency doesn't come from speaking practice alone. It comes from internal practice first. It comes from building that mental foundation where English becomes your thinking language, not just your speaking language.
Right, and once you understand that, it changes everything because you stop putting so much pressure on yourself to perform, you stop feeling like you have to speak perfectly right now, and you give yourself permission to develop fluency at the pace your brain needs, which is different for everyone, and that's okay.
So let's wrap this up because I think we've covered a lot. And I want to make sure that if someone's been listening to this whole episode, they walk away with something really clear and actionable.
Yeah, so here's the main idea. If you understand English but you freeze when you try to speak, it's not because you don't know enough English. It's because your brain is still processing English through translation. And translation takes too much mental energy. It overloads your brain, and that's what causes the freeze.
And the solution isn't to force yourself to speak more, it's to train your brain to think in English first. Because once you can think in English naturally, speaking just becomes an extension of that thinking, and the freeze disappears.
Exactly. And the simplest way to start is with that 2 to 3 minute habit we talked about. Just lying in bed before you sleep and forming simple thoughts in English. No pressure, no performance, just letting your brain practice in a safe, private space.
And over time, that internal fluency will build, and when you're in a real conversation, your brain won't have to translate anymore. It'll just respond in English automatically, and you'll finally feel like you can express yourself the way you want to.
So if there's one thing you take away from this episode, it's this. Think in English first, speaking comes later.
That's it. That's the whole thing right there.
Thanks so much for listening. And if this episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And we'll be back next time with another conversation about the real side of learning English.
Take care, and remember, fluency is built in your mind before it ever comes out of your mouth.